welcome everybody to this plenary session, Worker Solidarity with Ukraine. We've got three speakers, Tom Harris, who's here in London, Denis Pilash, who is in Ukraine, who's speaking from Social Movement, and Alice Alaboskaya, who is speaking from Alt Left, a Russian leftist and anti-war organization. So we're going to hear first from Denis. So we're going to hear first from Denis Pilash from Social Movement, who's going to speak for 50 minutes, and then from Ala, and then from Tom.
Hello, comrades. It's a great honor to be here. You have a great program for your event, and actually it's inspiring for people who live in a literal hell, like millions of Ukrainians now. Because since 24th of February, since Russia's right-wing conservative dictatorship has unleashed its attack on the people of Ukraine, we faced probably the biggest tragedy and obviously the biggest threat for the mere existence of people here since the Nazi invasion in the Second World War. So it caused enormous destruction throughout the country. We have probably dozens of thousands of civilians already dead, and many millions of people whose lives were completely disrupted by the war, who had to displace in a way or another. So though some of them have already returned, like we have, including those more than 2 million people who have come back from foreign countries. However, the situation is still very dire, and the recent week was a perfect example for this. So the Russian missile and aircraft attacks on Ukraine, they intensified. And actually, it reminded that no region in Ukraine can be considered safe, because the Russian missiles hit almost every region, from Lviv to Kharkiv, and obviously to Donbass. That is now the place for the most heavy hostilities. And it also included attacks on residential areas, on a sea resort in the Odessa region, on kindergarten in Kiev, on car wash in Zhytomyr region, and probably the most infamous shopping mall in Kremenchuk. And each of these attacks claimed dozens of human lives. So we had, even in terms of magnitude, an increase of number of civilian casualties throughout the country. And not to speak even about what's happening in Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, Mykolaiv regions, the regions in the east and south. Kharkiv actually also is constantly shelled. So there, Russia is still pushing through, trying to grab as much land as it can. And also it means to destroy as much cities and towns as it can, because we have this long list of almost completely destroyed places there, from the biggest one, Mariupol, to the smaller ones, Volnovakha, Izum, Severodonetsk recently, now in Lysychansk. Like they fired on a line of people who were standing for water. So yeah, it's still pretty much the reality, and many people in abroad, they have some perception as if something has changed. Yes, we have prevailed in a number of directions, and the battle for Kiev was ultimately won by the Ukrainian side, and Kharkiv is also almost recently the Snake Island in the Black Sea, that had been like a place for constant shelling from Ukrainian artillery. It's what Russians also fled from there and claimed it's a goodwill gesture. It was at the same time when the rockets were hitting lots of civilians throughout the country. And but what helped us withstand with this imperialist challenge from the regional major imperialist in the region was actually a big mobilization of Ukrainian people, men and women from different regions, Ukrainian, Russian-speaking, from other ethnic communities, people mostly from the working class who in a way or another have joined the resistance, not only in the literal way, though still we have lots of people who volunteered for the territorial defense units and for the armed force of Ukraine, including lots in the independent unions. And sometimes you can go to the web pages of, say, the Independent Miners Union in Kryvyi Rih or Chervonograd and see this list of obituaries for people who have already been killed on the front line, but also the people who kept everything going in the country and who did basically their job as essential workers, or who became ones by joining different humanitarian aid spontaneous networks that were emerging throughout the country, helping the people to relocate. And actually the railway workers did an enormous job to save the lives of millions of people by risking their own in many cases. The same applies to healthcare workers, to emergency services workers, but also to others. So people who are usually not so much promoted as someone heroic, however, who were quite essential for preserving others' lives and helping distribute medicine, food, and everything necessary for those whose lives were torn apart. And in this way, it's enormously shameless. What was the reaction of the ruling class here? Because any capitalist class in any situation, it will use actually such kind of shock situation to pursue its own interests on behest of the working majority. And the same essential workers who were so essential for Ukraine's defense and resistance, and who are risking their lives every day, they are now facing lots of anti-social, anti-labor initiatives made by different quite neoliberal, market enthusiastic members of parliament and people in the ministries. So just at the moment, we are combating one of the laws that will effectively endanger with all the workers employed at workplaces with less than 250 people, that their labor protections will be just dismantled, and actually their right to unionize and somehow to defend their rights, it will also be made obsolete by these changes. So this is one of these anti-labor laws that we are now opposing. And here I can say about what our organization does. So I'm from the social movement, political organization that stands for socialism and freedom, and that challenges the neoliberal capitalist, oligarchic capitalist, peripheral capitalist order in Ukraine. So with the start of war, as many NGOs, as many other groups, we tried to do all our best to to contribute to the help to the refugees, IDPs, to other people who have been affected by the war. But also we started a number of projects to protect labor rights on both individual level. So we get these reports from the people whose rights have been violated, and also on a more systematic level to raise the awareness, including in the unions, in the both union entities in Ukraine, the Federation of Trade Unions and the Confederation of Free Trade Unions, to mobilize them and to oppose some of these very dangerous initiatives. And also we are trying to build these networks of international solidarity. So I think that Tom will speak about his and his comrades' visit to Lviv for one of these events, but also it's lots of such online events and building networks of solidarity across the borders. And it's quite important to have these demands and the plight of Ukrainian working class raised by comrades abroad. And we are very grateful for what Ukraine Solidarity Campaign and Workers' Liberty does for real solidarity, and for also bringing together all these issues that we are now facing by this shameless aggression, and we can say that, for instance, the plight of the refugees from Ukraine, regardless of their origin and their citizenship, it's also the part of the bigger problem of the refugees and asylum seekers throughout the world. And you know what's happening now, what happened in Melilla, dozens of people killed by Moroccan and Spanish security, what's happening in Palestine, what's happening with the Kurdish people, again in the context of this all this trade of their interests on behalf of some geopolitics and so on. And actually, what's also necessary to stop the imperialist invasion against Ukraine, because it's setting a quite dangerous precedent for encouraging actually all other imperialists. We are no more living in some kind of unilateral world. We live in a situation with lots of imperial and sub-imperialist powers that use their military machines and their other ways to suppress smaller people, smaller countries, and you can name it, starting from so Russia as and fossil fuel empire. It's genetic. It's in a way something like Saudi Arabia and its criminal war in Yemen. And it's a real pity that many people in the West, they have this delusion that somehow the Russian imperialism is a counterpoint, some dialectical negation of the Western one, not its continuation. However, we see this as a complete like in the same line, and it's very dangerous, especially today, because Putin has become some kind of beacon for the far right in Europe, and his vision of the world is this vision that completely negates not only the right of Ukrainians to basically exist, because lots of his top officials and his media has promoted this lines with genocidal implications, actually, that like Ukrainian identity and separate Ukrainian republic has to be obliterated. And what his government is doing throughout the post-Soviet space, suppressing protests in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in generally upholding different authoritarian regimes. But it's also a vision where only big powers will have any right to do anything on the international arena, and where only the right of force, of brute force, will rule. So it's a dystopia of Putin's, Trump's, Bolsonaro's, and Modi's, like shambling the world and leaving no space for oppressed people and for independent workers' movement as well. So once again, thanks for your solidarity. And we also convey our own solidarity for your struggles, for those examples of class struggles that are now ongoing in the UK, like the struggle of the railway workers. So our friends from the Free Trade Union of Railway Workers, they also convey their solidarity and their support to you. Thanks, and I'll be happy to answer your questions in the discussion.
Thanks, Dennis. So our next speaker is Alla, who's an editor of left-wing media platform Alt Left. You'll have about 10 to 15 minutes, Alla.
Hey, hi everyone. My name is Alla Voyskaya. I'm a political activist and an editor of the Russian left-wing media Alt Left. Thank you so much for having me today. I would like to speak about the problems of the Russian anti-war movement. Official Russian propaganda is trying to convince people that all Russians support the war in Ukraine, but it doesn't match reality. From the first day of the war, many Russians stood up against it. Thousands of people have taken to the streets and manifested against the invasion to Ukraine in February, in March, but the street protests were quickly repressed by the government, by the police. In March, Russian parliament adopted a law to protect the Russian army against discreditation, which made any critical statements about the war illegal. We can't even say that war is a war. We need to use the phrase special military operation instead. One of our comrades was detained because of anti-war picture on social media. Because of repressions, many activists went abroad. Despite all of both the anti-war resistance still exists in Russia. Many remaining activists continue agitation against invasion online. Some other distribute anti-war leaflets, create graffitis, while many military recruitment offices across Russia have been set ablaze. Unfortunately, the anti-war movement in our country is fully in the hands of liberals who use ineffective tactics and often make big strategic mistakes. Popular liberal politician Alexei Navalny, who is now in prison, called for an everyday peaceful street protests. After just a few days, this protest died out. We don't have enough activists who are ready to go to the streets every day. Many have been arrested. Liberals in post-Soviet countries don't use strikes, sabotage, or organized forms of protests. The tactics they use often fail. It happens in 2020 and in 2021, both in Belarus and during anti-government protests in Russia's far eastern city of Khabarovsk. Another problem is the chauvinistic and imperialistic character of the Russian anti-war movement leaders. Some of them propose to issue a passport of a good Russian to any anti-war Russian live abroad in order to let them open a bank account, rent property, and get access to other services. The whole idea of this proposal is absurd and wrong. as it can lead to discrimination of ordinary Russians and at the same time allow those who are close to Putin to avoid punishment. For example, Putin's daughters who are married to foreign nationals can just pass the ownership of their assets to them. Also, it's important to say that in our language, there are two words to say Russian, which have different meanings. One means a citizen of the Russian Federation, Россиянин. The other one means the ethnic group of Slavs, who are the biggest ethnic group in Russia, Русский. When they say passport of a good Russian, they use the second word, Русский, which means they label as Russian all ethnic minority groups such as Tatars, Bashkirs, Kalmyks, who are also citizens of Russia but are not Slavs. Recently, there have been several racist scandals in Russian opposition politics. A popular blogger, Maxim Katz, has said that Caucasian people are more brutal towards Ukrainians because they are not Slavs and therefore unable to look at Ukrainians as their own kind of people. Another story emerged on YouTube show Popular Politics, where a host said that Russian people who went to war are most very poor, as well as representatives of ethnic minorities, and therefore are not the best people. All these cases don't surprise me because many people who lead the anti-war movement today earlier supported the war in Chechnya. Like, for example, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was a famous business figure in the 20s. Can we be sure that these people won't start another war if they come to power in Russia? We don't need another war. We don't need imperialists in government. Only radical measures can stop the war, and socialists and Democrats must be the driving force which would implement this measure. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ella. And our last speaker is the one that is in the room. Tom Harris is a PCS rep, a member of Workers' Liberty, and along with myself and Kelly was on the Workers' Solidarity delegation to Ukraine recently. So Tom, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking our previous speakers. I think we're incredibly privileged to be able to hear from them. And we're in a historical moment when it's possible to discuss with workers and left-wing activists across the world in a way that would have been really difficult previously. You know, you think of the times in history when to try and make working class solidarity across borders, that was incredibly difficult. People had to smuggle themselves across borders. You'd get to some conference in another part of Europe only to discover that everyone had been arrested. And here we are, thanks to the globalization of the modern world and also to technology, we are able to have these discussions, to hear firsthand from people struggling in the countries affected. And whilst sometimes the idea of little left-wing organisations taking positions on international struggles or global conflicts might seem a bit abstract, I think we've got an opportunity now in a kind of fairly unprecedented way to make those things material and real. So as has been mentioned, me and Ruth and Kelly went to Lviv in Western Ukraine just about a couple of months ago, where we were able to hear from Ukrainian trade unionists, the Ukrainian socialist left, and other activists fighting for the liberation of women, of LGBT people, of oppressed minorities. And we found out a lot. And one thing I hope to come back to later in this speech is that the main thing we found out is that the Ukrainian left exists and that they should not be written out of the narrative in a way that I think often does happen in the left discourse on this topic. So, and the other thing we find that we see is that the thing that overwhelmingly comes out is that the Ukrainian left is fighting. Rail workers fighting to keep themselves and their colleagues alive as they're targeted by missiles and gunfire from the Russian invaders. Coal miners literally fighting near the front lines. Many workers have been pulled into the, volunteered in the army and territorial defence units, and their trade union networks are supporting them, supplying them, providing them with information, providing them with expertise, providing them with materials. We heard from healthcare workers, members of their union in occupied areas of Ukraine had been forced to leave their Ukrainian trade union and join a Russian one, and to accept worse contracts on worse deals. We heard from women's activists doing the best they can to hold together the infrastructure that the women's movement in Ukraine has built up over decades, even amidst the chaos of invasion and amidst the horrific spread of sexual violence as a weapon of war by the Russian invaders. We heard from LGBT activists who were running collectives in Kiev and campaigning for LGBT rights, who were very aware that as horribly inadequate as the legal situation of LGBT people is in Ukraine, it's nowhere near as bad as it potentially could be if Putin's army take control. And this LGBT Kiev would vote each month on which military unit they would be donating half of their funds to. That is to say that the Ukrainian people are fighting against the Russian invader, and they are also, and the Ukrainian left is also fighting to defend working class interests against a Zelensky government that, for all of the heroism and I think genuine inspirational nature of that government's war campaign, is nevertheless a capitalist bourgeois government that is prosecuting the class struggle on Ukrainian workers under the guise of war measures, just as you would expect it to. And we heard from comrades in Ukraine who are fighting to oppose privatization of Ukrainian industry, and fighting against the neoliberalization of Ukrainian labor law, and fighting to expose bosses who use the supposed exigencies of war as a reason to sack people, lay them off, attack their rights, attack their pay. Now, I foreground that at the beginning of my speech because it establishes that the Ukrainian left is fighting and that it has agency and it has an opinion, and that the Ukrainian workers are not merely pawns in some broader chess game. And that is the view that I think you would get from many on the left currently. It's the view certainly you get from people like Stop the War, the SDBP. It's an argument that some of you may have heard in your union conferences recently, and I think it needs to be opposed. Their view is that really the war is just kind of a piece of puppetry between American imperialism and Russia. Russia was provoked into invading because of NATO expansionism. And really the West is the only thing to blame. And I think that writes out it writes out Ukrainian history as a former colony of Russia. It writes out the democratic right of the Ukrainian people to determine the future and fate of their own country without imperialist interference. And it also just doesn't tally up with the facts whatsoever. Vladimir Putin, a few months before the invasion, as has been already mentioned, comes out with this thesis in which he says that the Ukrainians are not really a separate nation; they're merely just Russians. That Ukraine doesn't have a right to independent existence, and that Ukraine as a separate entity was all just a Bolshevik mistake. And still, Stop the War and the left and some parts of the left think that, in fact, this war is just because Putin was nervous about NATO. I think basically, if Putin came out with a big T-shirt on saying "I love imperialism" and a big burglar's bag with swag written on it, and marched around shouting "I want to reconquer an old Russian colony," loads of the left would still be like, "I feel your pain, brother. I understand. NATO should never have done that to you." It's nonsense. It's funny, but it's also appalling. Because this is a humanitarian catastrophe, and we owe a debt of solidarity to a workers' movement, a women's movement, and a left that is struggling in a life and death struggle for its existence. So I think we need to be raising slogans. Many of them were brought up by comrades in Ukraine, and I think we should be carrying them forward in the movement. The first thing to do is to loud-voicedly and clear-throatedly oppose the Russian invasion. And not to paint it in some kind of equivocal terms. The second one is to call for arms for Ukraine. Now, I think even people in the Morning Star might on some abstract level say that they think that Ukraine has the right to self-determination. But when you push them on what that means materially, they will start to pull back when you specify, well, if Ukraine has a right to be free, and if Ukraine has a right to defend itself, then consequently Ukraine needs the material means to defend itself. It needs arms. Now, unfortunately, the only people able to provide them with arms at the moment are Western governments. So we need to steer away from allowing our movement to view that as a bad thing. Because sad though it is to say, there isn't currently a free trade, like a fair trade, ethical commune in Bristol somewhere that can make kind of LGBT positive, sex friendly, ecological, you know, whatever, arms that can arrive in. Unfortunately, it's the bastards like Boris Johnson and Biden and other NATO countries that can provide them. So we should be saying that our government should be providing Ukraine with the weapons it needs to defend itself. Now, that is not to say, however, that we should flip into full-out support for NATO. Firstly, because NATO and its constituent governments cannot be relied upon to pursue a democratic or let alone socialist policy in Ukraine. NATO recently allowed Sweden and Finland in through negotiations pressured by Turkey, which basically meant that in order to be part of NATO, Sweden and Finland would have to agree to stop harbouring refugees from the Kurdish independence struggle, and that NATO would have to soft pedal whatever opposition and restraint it was exercising on Turkey's right to intervene in Rojava. That, I would say, is indicative of an alliance that is exactly what you think it is, a group of imperialist nations. So we can't rely on, we can't fold ourselves into support for NATO or rely on NATO to fight on the workers' behalf and on the behalf of the workers of Ukraine. Another sign that Western governments can't be relied upon to do that is that if they really wanted to provide a fillip and a big kind of bolstering shot in the arm for Ukraine, they could cancel their international debt. The Ukrainian government is weighed down by enormous amounts of debt, even whilst it's having to further indebt itself to buy arms to fight the struggle. So if our Western governments were serious, they would cancel that debt. They won't, because they're capitalist bastards. But it's something that our union should be raising and agitating for. Also, in Britain, we have a particular responsibility for what our government could be doing in relation to Ukraine, in that I mentioned earlier there are laws to privatize, basically to neoliberalize labour relations in Ukraine. There's currently one going through the Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, called 5371. And Britain has a particularly disgraceful little hand in that legislation going through. And it was our Foreign Office that pushed the Ukrainian government months ago to adapt legislation along those lines as a means of allegedly making it more integratable into the West. And that law would make it much easier to sack workers. It would mean that you could sack workers without consultation with unions. So we should be using our trade unions in Britain to raise a bit of a hue and cry internationally and in the situation of British politics to say that we oppose any attacks on the rights of Ukrainian workers, and we particularly oppose any influence of our British government to push that legislation through. We should also be demanding that the borders are open to refugees, to all refugees. That goes without saying, but the government likes to paint itself up as a friend of the Ukrainian refugees, when in reality we've done very poorly at letting them in. All the other countries in Western Europe, including countries the other side of us from Ukraine, like Ireland, have done much better. So we need to be providing a safe haven for Ukrainian refugees and refugees in general. But we should also be using the opportunities presented to us by technology and by events like this to make material links with the Ukrainian left and the trade union movement. And we should also be using that to do the same thing with the Russian anti-war movement and the Russian left, difficult as that might be considering their brutal repression. We should be doing the same for the underground workers' movements in Belarus. So to conclude, we should neither fall into this idea that Russia rather than being a predatory imperialist power, is just reacting to American imperialism. We should put the blame squarely on Russia and its imperial war. We should not rely on NATO, which is a collection of self-interested capitalist imperialist powers. We should demand, nevertheless, that our governments stop doing the bad things that they're doing in Ukraine and provide arms to Ukraine. And we should remember a slogan that was brought up by the German workers' movement in the Franco-Prussian War in the late 19th century, which was to say that tyrants of all lands are our enemies and the workers of all lands are our friends. We can't rely on Boris Johnson or Biden to bring freedom to Ukraine. We can't rely on Putin to see sense and be miraculously won over to some peaceable policy. The people who will bring a just end to this war with freedom for Ukraine and who will eventually lead to a war where such tyranny and massacre and exploitation is ended are people like we've been speaking to in this call, but also people in this room, the workers of all lands united for a world of peace and democracy and socialism.